today. Thank you very much for coming to this program, which is sponsored really from the Mexican Consulate in Yuma, actually, and also the SILC, the School of International Letters and Culture. But Tino actually was invited by the Mexican Consulate in Yuma because he participated in this migrant poetry reading yesterday. And he was gracious enough to accept our offer of coming to ASU before he left for Boston. Okay, so thank you, Tino.
Thanks, Willie.
I'm going to say a little brief things about Tino and then, of course, ask him to read his poetry. Tino was born in San Marcos, Texas. He received his BA from Southwest Texas University in San Marcos. He's a Master's of Arts from the State University of New York in Buffalo, and his PhD in Spanish literature from Boston University. Presently, Tino serves as a senior lecturer in the Department of Roman Studies, also at Boston University. Tino is the author of several books of poetry, among them Shaking Off the Dark, Crónica de mis años peores, translated as Chronicles of My Worst Years, Primera causa, First Cause, Escena de la película Gigante, translated to Scene from the movie Giant, which was awarded the American Book Award in 1994, and his latest publication, So Spoke Penelope, which is published
in March this year.
March of this year. Tino Villanueva is one of the most celebrated writers that emerged from the Chicano movement of the 1960s and 70s. This is important to highlight, for Tino's poetic voice has served as a source of inspiration to writers and academics that have shaped the growth of Chicano letters over the last 40 years, all done with the same humility and social commitment that defines his work. So let's applause for Tino. And all his work that he's done. Tienes la palabra.
Muy bien. Let's see. Okay. Thank you so much, Professor. This is my first time in Arizona, and I've had a kind of busy schedule yesterday, all day, and then today. I feel more comfortable in an academic setting because this is what I do. I think I know my way around a classroom, after teaching for many years. And I've done many readings. It's just difficult as one publishes another book. It gets more difficult to organize a reading because you keep deleting poems from previous books that you thought were important poems. So I certainly want to read from my latest book. A writer is always excited about the latest production, the latest publication. And in my case, it's 32 poems under the title of So Spoke Penelope. Penelope from Greek mythology, as we receive her through Homer in the Odyssey. So I'll say a few words about it. So I want to get to that book. Poems that come at the very end. You also have a handout, and I'll say no to you when those poems come up. And I want to point out several things about those poems that you have in hand. I'm going to do a chronological reading. I'm going to start with my first book, Hay Otra Voz Poems. Now this looks a little bit ratty. I have like 5 other, it's out of print. It's from 1972. This is the 3rd edition. The original edition, I only have 1 copy of. The very first edition had the very European look, very Latin American look that has the inner flap and in the front and the inner flap in the back. This is the 3rd edition, and the editor decided not to follow that same design. Anyway, so this is the one I carry around, and it's all a little bit mussed up. So I'll start. I'll pick poems that reflect different themes, different preoccupations throughout the years that I've been writing. Some of these poems were written when I was a freshman, sophomore in college, some in graduate school, and some after that. I'm going to start with this, with Hay Otra Voz poems. I'd like to start with My Certain Burn Toward Pale Ashes. I decided quite early in my college career, in fact, the very first semester, that I wanted to major in Spanish and minor in English. So I took a lot of courses in Spanish and a lot of courses in English. And in one of my English classes, which was the English Romantics, during that semester, I think it was October '67, something like that. The Vietnam War was still going on, so I decided to write a poem on the Vietnam War. I thought it was a pretty neat poem. It was in quatrains, and it rhymed ABBA. It had a scheme to it. And I took it to my professor, Professor Archer. And I always give Professor Archer credit. I always mention his name because this was a life-changing moment. I took the poem to his office during office hours, and he looked at it, and he said, well, you know, in the 20th century, poets don't rhyme. It's free verse. You know, let me show you what another poet has done with war, the theme of war. So he reached over to the Edward Honig and Oscar Williams paperback Mentor anthology, which I still have, and he turned to E.E. Cummings' I Sing of Olaf. This poem by E.E. Cummings is a conscientious objector type of poem. I sing of Olaf, big and strong, who recoiled at war. So he's sitting behind his desk, and I'm sitting on a chair, and I couldn't detect any rhyme, but yet there was some kind of cadence to it, some kind of rhythm, something that was pleasant to the ear, something seductive that language does. And then he disavowed knowing anything about it. He was teaching the Romantics. Shelley, Byron, you know, the rest, Wordsworth. He disavowed knowing anything about modern poetry. He said, why don't you go over to Dr. Peterson, who teaches the creative poetry workshops, show him, tell him I sent you over, show him the poem, which I did. And he said, yes, what you need to learn is the modern idiom. And I didn't know exactly what the modern idiom was. He says, let me show you. So he took an anthology, I can't remember which it was exactly. So he turns to the beats. So he shows me, he reads to me parts of Gregory Corso's poem, Marriage. He probably showed me something from Ferlinghetti and Ginsberg, obviously. Then he turned to Dylan Thomas and he said, look at this. And I started reading from Fernhill, In My Craft and Sullen Art, which does have very interesting cross rhymes. Then he showed me T.S. Eliot. He turned to a poem by T.S. Eliot, which I later tracked down. It's called Gerontion. And what he wanted to point out, and by this time he's standing up and I'm standing up, and he says, look at this. In the juvenescence of the year came Christ Tiger. He said no one had ever made that relationship between Christ and a tiger. This is fresh imagery. This is fresh language. No, it's creative, but there's no rhyme. No. So I wasn't there more than 10 minutes, but it changed my life. So I went to the bookstore and bought the books by these writers. And the fellow whose language seduced me was Dylan Thomas. There was something about his language. It was very compact, very economized. He used a lot of alliteration, I noticed. Compound adjectives. Now, this is something beautiful about the English language that Spanish cannot do and no Romance language can do, which is to string along compound adjectives by simply using a hyphen. And it can be one hyphen, there's two words with a hyphen in between, or it can be 3 or 4 or 5 or 6. You just keep putting little hyphens. And if you're coming to English and learning English as a second language, these adjectives are not in the dictionary. These are created, very creative. You create your own adjectives. And all I have to do is go to the New York Times of the day that I'm reading and buy it. We tried today to buy a copy of the LA Times or the New York Times. And when I'm in Boston, it's either the Boston Globe or the New York Times. We weren't successful. But El Profesor had a copy of the Arizona Republic here from Friday, August 30th, and it'll do. Usually I find 9 or 10 or 11 of these compound adjectives. Here I find 5, and then also with nouns you can use the hyphen. And what is it that we find? Well, here's a subtitle that says that Madonna, the lookout, says he won't second guess. You can do it with verbs. The verb is guess, but you can second guess. And all you have to do is put a hyphen in between. Here's what I'm talking about, a brush-filled canyon. What kind of canyon is it? It's a brush-filled canyon. That's the adjective. You won't find this in the dictionary, okay? How about long-term effects? This has to do with some kind of landmark concussion settlement. Same-sex couples. What kind of couples are they? They're same-sex. All right, so there are 5 of these they did that. Here's with nouns, star trails time lapse. I guess if you go out camp under the stars, you have to go to what is that? Mongolian Rim? Does anyone know about that? Anyway, what I'm saying is that this attracted me about Dylan Thomas's language. And the other thing was the monosyllabic words. Again, Spanish cannot do this, French cannot, Portuguese cannot, no Romance language can do this. To string along single syllable words, monosyllabic words, and make sense. Of course we can string along in Spanish single syllable words, but I'm talking about making sense, making a sentence, making a nice Western sentence with a subject, a verb, and a complement. That Spanish cannot do, nor French, nor any of the Romance languages. So, my first 3 or 4 poems that I did in English, which were later published in a newspaper, and this was very important for a writer to have worked very hard on poems and then to see them actually published and people talking about it. My classmates, oh, I saw your poem in the San Antonio Express News, and my parents and my professors. So let me read this poem that is an imitation. These were imitation poems, and it's very important. It was very important for me to get into the language of Dylan Thomas and find out what he was doing with language, and then I myself was imitating. I'm imitating his voice. This is not my voice. Later I would find my voice, okay? Every writer has to find his own voice, her own voice. But this I wanted to sound like Dylan Thomas. I later read his biography, a little bit of his biography, very interesting fellow. Came to New York 3 times. The last time, alas, they say he drank 18 whiskeys at the White Horse Saloon in New York, and he went into a coma and he died November of 1953. You can Google him, you'll find out. Very interesting Welsh poet. Here's an imitation. It's about death. It's about birth and death, and it's one of his themes. He's known as the womb tomb poet. My certain burn toward pale ashes. My certain burn toward pale ashes is told by the hand that whirls the sun. Each driving breath beats with a quick pulsing face. My falling stride like sand toward decision drains heavy with fixed age. Each ghostly grain a step in time that measures tons. My ruddy sea that streams to dryness bears bewildered its clay bone. Each vessel's roar at God's speed drowns by force. My waking light began when the fertile lips spun my pulse. And I, with muted tongue, was drawn, destroyed from the making mouth into this mass. And held below by nature, the sweeping hand now turns my dust-bound youth. Tell the world that I was struck by the sun's grave plot. Now, I know you weren't keeping up or counting, but I once read a poem by Thomas. At this stage, when I wrote the poem, I saw a poem that had 18 monosyllabic words in a row. So when I wrote this poem, I put in 19. And it starts with, after sweeping, hand now turns my dust-bound youth, tell the world that I was struck by the sun's grave plot. So it's a way to top the master. And I kept reading him, and I found another one that had like 23. I said, all right, I'm not going to write another one. I get the point. I also was reading the beats, and this has a different rhythm. This doesn't have a Dylan Thomas sound to it. I read Ginsberg, I read Ferlinghetti, but I was more attracted to Dylan Thomas. But here's a poem that What I never read up on the beats. I didn't know what they were about really. It's only years later that I found out they were crazy about jazz. Okay, I was only reading the poets and I was imitating them as well. So this poem has a very jazzy, a very different kind of cadence. Okay, it's called Catharsis, and you might identify with it. It comes at the end of a spring semester, and you have to study for finals. And so here's what happens. Catharsis. Into the page-stuffed night and Pavlovian-like response at semester's end, I go groping through Lorca's New York surrealism, Whitman symbology, greenboard formulas, and untangling dangling participles by midnight tick-tock alarm clock. In late fall and spring comes this ritual of grotesque notebooks, thoughts surrounded by underlined paragraphs of future. And shortly, early rays come solid through the curtains and my cramming for a final classroom catharsis. With only the morning sun for breakfast, turning the pages in habitual syndrome with cigarette, I yield to nausea. All right. At one point when this book came out, I could fill up the hour with just reading from here, but I have to leave it. Shaking Off the Dark. I didn't mention that this is from 1984, published by Arte Público Press and reprinted in 1998, by an office not too far from here, Bilingual Press, Editorial Bilingüe. I forgot to mention that the structure of the book is, there are poems in Spanish, in standard, academic, continental, radio and television examinational Spanish, and poems in standard academic English, and poems that combine both languages. And when I get to one of the sheets here, I'll talk about those binary poems. And this book also has the same structure, divided into 5 parts. Let me read from the very first part. Has to do with creativity, with the muse, with inspiration. What is inspiration, and how come we have it one moment and then it goes away from us, and we get into these fallow moments, writer's block, whatever you want to call it. Where does inspiration go? How do you get it back? So, very first part deals with that idea. Something beyond light. Horizon cleared of mist, claiming part beauty, part dreams. I move toward it in search of names worth saving, ordering stages of my life within the grace that keeps giving. Unbounded, the landscape and the simple stones shudder in dawn's cast. I accept this endless peace. I am called to by something beyond light. Everything matters, feels more generous, alive. I see as I've never seen before. In this long, shimmering present, I write out my heart's memory, tell stories under the spell of my own senses. Line by line, I break silence with words too sudden to refuse. There comes that moment when the words start coming, and this is when you have to take advantage of the moment. You've been working on this poem, and you don't know where it's going, but suddenly there it is. No? So you think that you've hit the mother lode, and you got to go for it. No? The other point I want to read from here is 26. As I said, I want to read poems with different themes. This is a poem about Anne Sexton, one of our major American writers, belonging to the conventional school of poetry, with Mr. Robert Lowell at the head. Lowell was the teacher of Sylvia Plath, and this is a very intense group of people. Some of them committed suicide, and so did Anne Sexton. So Anne Sexton was also a student of Robert Lowell, and I guess for the first time in American poetry, this idea of presenting a persona in a poem disappears. So that when the writer says that he or she is having marital problems, emotional problems, problems with alcohol, they are talking about themselves. In fact, Ginsburg actually mentions names of actual people. So there is no persona out there. These are themselves. Anne Sexton had been having emotional problems. She had been already in institutions. And in 1974, she seemed to be cured. She was teaching creative writing at Boston University, and then one day she goes to her garage, turns on the engine to her car, shuts the door of the garage, turns on the engine of the car, and commits carbon monoxide. Did its work, and committed suicide that way. She was born in 1928 and died in 1974. When she did this, she added her name to quite a distinguished roster of American poets who, in the 20th century, took their lives, beginning with Hart Crane, who, coming back from Mexico on a ship, before it reached Brooklyn, New York, he jumped off the boat and drowned, committed suicide that way. That was in the 20s, as I recall. In 1955, Weldon Keyes jumped off the Golden Gate Bridge. They found his car nearby. He was always talking about jumping off the Golden Gate Bridge. They never found his body, but found his car there. The following year, Randall Jarrell ran onto the oncoming traffic, and he was hit by a car and committed suicide that way. There's Hemingway, of course, also in the 60s. Sylvia Plath in London, who sticks her head in the oven and turns on the gas and so forth. There's a film, called Sylvia about that. And then Anne Sexton. I forgot 1972, January 72. John Berryman, teaching English up in the English department at the University of Minnesota, in January jumped off the bridge into the Mississippi River. Actually, he hit the ice. The river was frozen, and committed suicide that way. He was also part of the confessional school of poetry. And then Anne Sexton. So when that happened, I didn't know who she was, but I got to Boston in '71, and they were talking about her, but a terrific poet that she was. So I bought her books, and she is a terrific poet, wonderful poet. And she had groupies, and here's what here's what triggered off the poem. Denise Levertov said that after the suicide of Anne Sexton, that although Anne Sexton might have been cured, that because she had groupies, she felt compelled to write to an audience. And even if she wasn't having a personal emotional problem, she had to feign, she had to fake that she had an emotional problem, such that she had a relapse. She was down in the doldrums, and there was, whereas before somebody had already whereas before there was always a friend who would spot her depression and was able to catch her and so forth. There was nobody there, and so she took her life. That's Denise Levertov in an article that she wrote. So I felt kind of guilty about purchasing her books, and that's also added to. That's also behind the poem. Now, as we drop, a poem of guilt for Anne Sexton, 1928-1924. It was for therapy you sang from the wounded house. It had come to that, releasing passion from the fist, working both ends of the clock to death. And those tangled images kept coming in volumes, slim and loud. How each poem became a resting place on one's private journey. How each time your breath kissed us awake, and for a while you straightened out the image, sharing it like homemade bread, like balloons 10 for a quarter. Then the tension broke, the cord snapped, so you summoned what made you feel more alive. You summoned death. Finally, you broke into the clear, rowing into the current waters toward the tall drawn horizon, framed weak for a steeple, rowing always against the dark, for nothing must have been lit in the sacred height. And there you were, engulfed in the fall, confessedly wrecked and undone by the fumes of the hurried act. You against death, death against you against you, hearing death grinding his engine, feeling death climbing up your limp breath, death, oh tasteless death, coming with his pale blue eyes. And choosing to live no more for a line, you braved it all the way, preferring heresy to pain, living up to your final word, that sullen act, and that is no sin before any God. But we are the death dealers, we who once read your life and bought your image. Now, as we drop toward our sound dreams, we toss with guilt and turn tangled in our sheets as your profile cuts our sleep. When I wrote this poem, and another poem I'm going to read right now, I thought that I had found my voice. I liked the way I sounded. I liked the line breaks. I liked the, the way the poem was grouped, the words were grouped together. The breath groups. Now, El Profesor has mentioned that yesterday we were with the migrant, the subject, the theme of the get-together was migrant workers, migration, and so forth. Up until the age of 17, I unfortunately followed my family around the cotton fields of Texas, sometimes chopping cotton, sometimes picking it. It wasn't my happiest moment of my life, and I've said as much in another book and some essays. So when I wrote Hay Otra Voz poems, there are 2 poems, one very long one that still gets, I still get requests to reprint it in readers. It's in Spanish, I wrote in Spanish. And the one in English also gets picked up, a little small one, which I won't read. I'll read this one. So when I wrote these 2 poems, I thought I was finished with that work type of poetry, with that experience. And lo and behold, here it appears here again, and appears in my next book, 2 more poems. And but here's one. Here's the shorter one. Haciendo apenas la recolección. It's a farm worker's recollection. It's very difficult to translate because there are a lot of puns going on here. Haciendo apenas la recolección. So you have apenas with one word, which means something. Apenas means something else. Recolección means the picking, piscar. It also means recollection. So you have a lot of things being bounced around here. It's very difficult to translate. So I just call it a farm worker's recollection. And I was working on my thesis, on my dissertation, sitting at the table, and I have a bookcase, and I have an atlas, which is still there, and it was kind of falling. That's a big thing. And so I stood up to just tap it back, and I didn't tap it back. I grabbed it and I opened it up and started flipping through it, and I saw the map of Texas, and all those memories came back. Okay, kind of like a Proustian moment. Haciendo apenas la recolección. For weeks now, I have not been able to liberate me from my name. Always I am history I must wake to. In idiot defeat, I trace my roots across a half-forgotten map of Texas. I smooth out the folds, stubborn as the memory. Let me see. I would start from San Marcos, moving northward, bored beyond recognition, in the stale air of a 52 Chevy. To my left, the youngest of uncles steadies the car. To my right, grandfather finds humor in the same joke. I am hauled among family extended across the back seat as the towns bury themselves forever in my eyes. Austin, Lampasas, Brownwood, past Abilene, Sweetwater, along the Panhandle's alien tallness. There it is, Lubbock, sounding harsh as ever. I press its dark letters, and dust on my fingertips is so alive, it startles them as once did sand. Then west, 10,000 acres and a finger's breadth, is level land, where a thin house once stood, keeping watch over me in my baseball glove, when the wrath of winds cleared the earth of stooping folk. There's Ropesville, where in 5th grade I didn't make a friend. My arm is taut by now and terrified. It slackens, begins falling back into place, while the years are gathering slowly along still roads and hill country, downward to where it all began, 500 Mackey Street. I am home, and although the stars are at rest tonight, my strength is flowing. Weep no more, my common hands. You shall not again pick cotton. Yeah, those 2 poems are pretty, still get to me. I'm going to read one poem from Chronicle of My Worst Years. It's been translated. I didn't bring any for sale. Only the original. Yeah, that's the one. This is the first edition, published in La Jolla by Lalo Press, and the third edition was done in Madrid. But James Hogarth, I have a translator. I don't translate my own work. Did a very nice job here with Northwestern University Press. It's out of print, and I didn't bring any. I think I had like 2 or 3 left. He translated 13 out of the 18 of the original. I'm not going to read. I'll read one at the very end. But it's about, there are 2 more cotton picking poems here. It's about living in San Marcos, and sometimes I divide literature into literature of lamentation and an article. Someone asked me to write something about my work, so I said, all right, it can be divided into poetry of lamentation and poetry of affirmation. So there are some affirmation poems in here, okay? As well as some lamentation. After all, things worked out okay. Here I am with you. I got educated, and I wouldn't be here if things had not come out right. Scene from the movie Giant. I'll set it up, and we're going to see the 6-minute segment from the 1956 film with Rock Hudson, Elizabeth Taylor, James Dean, and Dennis Hopper. It takes place in Texas. It's a generational tale being told here. Rock Hudson is a big rancher. He's got a lot of Chicano cowboys on the ranch. A lot of Mexican American help in the house. And toward the very end, James Dean's part is that he is bequeathed within this huge landed estate of Rock Hudson. He is willed, I think, like 100 acres or something, and so he digs for oil, and he hits oil. He gets a big oil man. Where was I going with this? Yes. Then there's a big celebration in his honor. It's a huge hotel, probably in Houston or Dallas, and the Benedicts, that is Rock Hudson and Elizabeth Taylor, have attended this big homage, and they're driving back. This is next to the last scene of the film. So Rock Hudson has aged. This is a generational tale being told. It's probably 1950. Someone who knows about cars once told me at a reading, I think in California somewhere, because I don't know if it's a 49 Ford or the 50 Ford. I like to think that it's 1950, right in the middle of the century, very symbolic, old Texas, new Texas. I'll talk about that in just a minute. Can you see the... Okay.
Let's stop at this driving up here and have us some chicken in the basket, and then we can eat it with time I drove by.
I get it.
What do you recommend, landlord? How's fried chicken?
A little Jesse wants ice cream, Grandpa.
Grandpa. Ice cream it shall be. Give the little feller some ice cream.
Ice cream? I thought that kid would want a tamale. All right, sweet, I do what you want.
What do you say, Juana? It's all right, isn't it?
He's good.
Yes, sirree. For all that fancy food and high linen, it's the life.
Hey, you.
Oh, now let's see. The big train should be arriving, Benedict, around 1:30. That should give the Hollywood people time.
Buenos dias.
Dallas?
You're in the wrong place, amigo. Come on, let's get out of here. Vamos, andale. Your money's no good here. Come on, let's go. You too.
Hold on a minute.
Yes? What do you want?
Now, look here, Sarge. Sure appreciate it if you were a little more polite to these people.
Oh, you would you?
I'm Big Benedict. Your neighbor, you might say.
Does that give you special privileges?
The name Benedict's meant something to people around here for a considerable time.
That there papoose down there. His name Benedict too?
Yeah, come to think of it. It is.
All right, forget I asked you. Now you just go back over there and sit down and we're gonna have no trouble. But this bunch here's gonna eat somewhere else. All right, come on, let's go. Come on, you two. Soon. You're out of line, mister.
I should have mentioned that the character of Dennis Hopper, who plays the son, doesn't want to follow cattle the rest of his life, so he's not very interested in being a cattleman. So he goes off either to Columbia University, somewhere in the East, Harvard Medical School, and becomes a doctor. And when he comes back, he ministers to the Chicano community that sits on the fringes of this big cattle ranch. And he has a nurse, Juana, this is Juana. They fall in love. Remember, it's 1950. And they have a child. Boy, what you saw. In 1950, in Texas, intermarriage between Anglo-Americans and Mexican-Americans was practically nil. Things have changed. And so this is a very gutsy scene by Hollywood, based on the Edna Ferber novel from 1952, which won a prize. Edna Ferber from Michigan, a newspaper woman, Jewish American, came to Texas and interviewed a lot of people. She came down twice, and so that's it. In the book, it appears differently. I was only dealing with a film. I had not read the book, and I didn't want to read the book. And I didn't want to know anything about Edna Ferber. But once the book was published, then I read up a little bit on Edna Ferber, who she was, and I read part of the actual novel, Giant. So I saw this in Texas when it came out. I was 14 years old, and I didn't see it again until when I got to Boston in 1972. Is that what I have here? I'm not going to read that poem. In 1973, there was a program on CBS called Thursday Night at the Movies, and they would show these famous films. And so I saw it again, and all those memories came back. I started taking notes. I said, I think I have a poem here. Well, I kept taking notes. It turned out to be 21 poems in the end. All right, let me read 3 poems. It's very difficult to read from it because I'm trying to do, there's a poem just to the waitress and what she represents, and a poem about the 3 elderly people that walk in. Who are they? They don't have any names. So I give them a little biography. Anyway, I'll read 3 poems. Scene from the movie Giant. What I have from 1956 is one instant at the Holiday Theater where a small dimension of a film, as in a dream, became the feature of the whole. It comes toward the end, the cafe scene which reels off a slow spread of light, a stark desire to see itself once more, though there is at times no joy in old-time movies. It begins with a jingling of bells and the plainer truth of it, that the front door to a roadside cafe opens and shuts as the Benedicts, Rock Hudson and Elizabeth Taylor, their daughter Luz and daughter-in-law Juana and grandson Jordy pass through it, not unobserved. Nothing sweeps up into an actual act of kindness into the eyes of Sarge, who owns this joint and has it out for dark-eyed Juana, weary of too much longing that comes with rejection. Juana from barely inside the door, and Sarge, stout and unpleased from behind his counter, clash eye to eye as time stands like hate. Silence is everywhere, acquiring the name of hatred, and Juana cannot bear the dread, the dark jowled gaze of Sarge against her skin. Suddenly, bells go off again. By the quiet effort of walking, 3 Mexican types step in whom Sarge refuses to serve. Those gestures of his, those looks that could kill a heart you carry in memory for years. A scene from the past has caught me in the act of living. Even to myself, I cannot say, except with worried phrases upon a paper, how I withstood arrogance in a gruff voice coming with the deep-dyed colors of the screen. How in the beginning I experienced almost nothing to say, and now wonder if I can ever live enough to tell the aftertale. I remember this, and I remember myself locked into a back row seat. I am a thin, flickering, helpless light, local looking, unthought of at 14. 28. Stop action. Impression. All right, this is a shorter poem. Stop action. Impression. Of course, the sanctity of the cafe, the just righteousness of the place, and Sarge, absolute, stressing the plane of outward fact, as when the screen gives up the deep in air-rooted sound of his voice, the strong ejectives and glottals, as when he unifies his muscle with a blunt instrument of his words, with which he tries to purge his roadside dominion, so that man and women by his side shall be cast out, left unregarded to their own. The eye gets insulted by light, and the thought descends that Sarge, or someone like him, can banish you from this hamburger joint, from the rest of your life not yet entered, from this holiday theater and all sense of place. Later it becomes clear that, I don't know if you picked up, but he's like a god. You know? He rules the place. And I won't read the other poem, where it's a little bit clearer. I wanted to read from the last section, 49. That autumn. Toward the end of the book, this still mentions the movie. The last two poems of the book do not mention the film anymore. What's been developing throughout is that you see a person who went to see a film as a young boy, and we find out toward the end that he has memory, and he's become a writer. And so the presence of memory and writing go together. So in this poem, the movie is still present. That autumn, the movie came to a close and went, and in time it was forgotten, placed upon the background of the past. And I returned to play and laughter, to class and lessons hardly learned. Each time I spoke, I lost a thought, or else said nothing to friends who might have seen the picture to the end, who might have been awakened, transfigured in some faint and inner way by rage. Now I think, the poem's the thing wherein I'll etch the semblance of the film. So the mind becomes involved again with aftersight, with frames as large as screens, and without wearing it as too much knowledge, something out of reach gets underway, and the two-sided act of myself in the available light behaves into words. So this is a writer coming through. Did anyone pick up on the poem's the thing wherein I'll etch the semblance of the film? Oh, Shakespeare. This is from Act 2, Scene 2, from Hamlet. When Hamlet suspects that Claudius has killed his father. So into the palace comes this traveling theater group. And Hamlet inserts this little section into what they're going to perform at the palace. And in this little act, in this little play that they're going to perform, there's a murder scene. And at the point of the murder, Hamlet is going to look over to Claudius to see if he has a guilty look, to see if he did it. No? So Shakespeare says, the play's the thing wherein I'll catch the conscience of the king. No? Very famous line. So I'm playing a little bit with that. You know what? I forgot to, when I was back in doing Shaking Off the Dark, I forgot to do the very first poem you have, the bilingual poem. This poem that you see that has two epigraphs from Alurista, a major, he taught us many things back in the 60s, early 70s. I read his poems in the early 70s. A major Chicano poet. When I first read his poems, I said, why does he have to mix Spanish with English? It's either got to be in Spanish or it's got to be in English. But still, I was a purist. But of course, that's a silly notion because artists are free to experiment with what they have. So we have two languages. So I started writing several poems like this. But when I got to this point, I was this is probably the most thought out poem that I've written. Because I wanted to know, I just didn't want to be skipping around helter skelter, nilly willy. I wanted to know why. Be conscious of why I was shifting from one language to another. Sometimes it's for puns. I can play with the language. I'll work from the sheet with you. Second strophe there where it says jugamos la vida. Now this is a very interesting expression in Spanish for jugarse la vida, translated as to put your life on the line. Interesting that I should have that expression have jugar in it. It's a reflexive verb, no? It has nothing to do with play, jugar, no? So I can't do that with English, no? So here's a play of where I'm trying to exploit both languages. So whenever I can use Spanish, I use it, I exploit it. And when I say exploit, I'm using it in the positive sense, to get maximum yield from something, okay? There is, of course, the negative side to the word to exploit. So this is a childhood poem. I had been reading, so I quote Alurista, when I read this in one of his poems, en el barrio, en las tardes de fuego, when the dust prowls en la calle desierta, pues los jefes y jefas trabajan, often late hours after school, we play canicas. Now, I had already been reading Dylan Thomas, and he's the master of the childhood poetry. You have to read two of his poems. Fern Hill, La Colina de los Helechos, and Poem in October, Poema de Octubre. No? Those are two major childhood poems, beautiful poems. So I already knew about that. So when I saw this about canicas, I said, well, I too had a childhood, and I played trompos and canicas myself, and cowboys and Indians, and I know it's not politically correct to play cowboys and Indians anymore, but that's what we did. So this is a childhood poem. You'll see that a lot of L's at the end of this first column, leaping, crawling, leaping, alcanzando hasta las delicias del vacío indomable, and then in the second column, some more L's, donde mi abuela tenía sembrados tulipanes y claveles, tulips and carnations. I don't want to use carnations, I want to use claveles because I get two L's there. Okay, so again, I'm exploiting Spanish. Correteando entre sol y resolanas, I get some more L's there. I get sol twice. And also there's this cultural note about resolanas, in any tropical, and Texas is tropical, in any hot, this is a word that we used to use at home, quítate de la resolana, me está pegando a la resolana. What is the resolana? If you go to the dictionary, it says glare. I once translated this poem because I was asked to translate it because it was going to appear in an all-English textbook. So I did. I translated it as reverberant glare. I don't know. What happens with resolana is that you can, on a very sunny, very hot sunny day, you can be under a big tree in the shade, and you can stay there all day. And you will, at the end of the day, you're going to be sunburned. Not by the sun because you've been in the shade, but you're going to be sunburned by the resolana. Okay? So it's a whole cultural thing here with this word is used a lot in the tropics, no? Y en Texas. So there's also a repetitive line. I hope you catch it. I won't tell you what it is. Anyway, the L's are very liquid. The linguists say that they're very lilting. Son muy saltarines, ¿no? Las L's, ¿no? Y hay un tono saltarín, there's a lot of jumping and leaping and saltando, no? Muy bien. I'm not going to read it all because it's too long and I'll run out of voice. I want to make sure that I finish, do right by you. I was not reading Dylan Thomas at this point in 1972. I had no interest in reading his poetry. I had learned what he had to teach me. I had trying to find my own voice. the language that I had used in imitating him, but that was his language, okay, not mine. But I was reading his essays, and in one essay he says, "The memories of childhood have no order and no end," and that's also part of the epigraphy, part of the epigraph. And sometimes I ask my students, "What's an epigraph?" So they confuse it with epitaph. No, it's not an epitaph. It's out in the cemetery in El Camposanto. No, an epigraph, these little quotes that begin a work. No? And the poem has something to do with the setup of the epigraphs. Jugábamos, saltábamos, jugábamos a todo. Era rito y recreación en el patio de mi barrio in the just awakening week, kneeling there in sunny bronze delight. My kingdom was a pocket full of golden marbles. How in wide-eyed wonder I sought winning 2 agates for my eyes, and so not knowing what it meant, I played for keeps. Jugábamos y nos jugábamos la vida. My posse always got its man. I was the Chicano Lone Ranger. I was Tarzan of backyard pecan trees. Time, tall trees blooming with the color of adventure. Trees that ripened with my age through rain-ruined days. Running, gambling I played, oblivious to find earth shifting in the cuffs of my fading jeans. Crawling, leaping, always reaching, alcanzando hasta las delicias del vacío indomable. Corriendo por los rincones de mi patio, donde mi abuela tenía sembrados tulipanes y claveles. Correteando por entre sol y resolanas en aquellas tardes de aquel fuego. Jugábamos, brincábamos, jugábamos a todo. Era mito y sensación when the treehouse wind blew in simultaneous weathers. Era un viento verde, sabor a higo, a hierbabuena, a veces a durazno, esencias de nuestro jardín. And in my crackerjack joy of late Saturday afternoons, my red wagon was full of dog, and my tricycle traveled one last time every turnpike of my yard. Now the fun running to soothe the dry sun on my tongue. Now the tires striding towards still water of buoyant ice cubes in a glass, transparent, dripping in the gripping of my mother's hand. Jugábamos, corríamos, jugábamos a todo. Era grito y emoción en mi predilecto pasatiempo. 13 years out of the womb, I was pubescent, Walter Mitty, fleet as Mickey Mantle at the stadium. Bueno, aquí entra lo de béisbol y todo eso. Did you pick up a line that keeps repeating itself? That's rhyming? Third line era rito y recreación. In the second column, second stroke, era mito y sensación. Y I just read era grito y emoción. If I do this in English, I lose the rhyme. So again, I'm exploiting Spanish here. Okay? Es un estribillo. In Spanish, we call it an estribillo. It's a repetitive line, no? A repetitive line that's embedded there. Okay. Now, when we were doing this, I said, boy, this is really, Agurista is onto something. Or whoever is writing, combining so many names for this. Code switching, hybrid poetry, binary poetry, interlingual poetry, bilingual poetry. Hay muchas, no? Well, it turned out, after a little bit of research, if you flip the page over on the back, I've done 2 articles, one in Spanish for Spanish consumption and one for English. Look on the right-hand column. Here's a poet who lives in Spain in the 11th century, 12th century, Yehuda Halevi. All you have to do is Google him or look at the Penguin Anthology. Even Penguin is published. I wish I could get published by Penguin. He's Jewish. At that time, 3 cultures lived in Spain. Judíos, moros, y cristianos. Okay? Moros, judíos, y cristianos. Y convivían, no? They lived together. And so he's using here, he's combining Hebrew words that are Romanized with the Spanish of the time. It's not known Spanish, it's called Proto-Spanish. Spanish just developing out of Latin, okay? Proto-Spanish. And there you see the modern Spanish, okay? Los árabes hicieron la misma cosa. The Moorish poets did the same thing, you know? Combining Arab and Spanish, no? So this is not new. In England, after the 1066 invasion of the Normans, not the Mormons, but the Normans, the Norman invasion, who brought French, into the court. Chaucer has poems in French. Here's a poet that's writing in the French of the time and in the English of that period. It's a love poem, and it's a longer poem. And then the female, la amante, the female responds. So this is a very long poem, okay? The lover, male lover, and the female lover that answers. It's a trilingual poem because he's introducing Latin just for good measure. Huh? Okay? Now, with the coming of the Spaniards to this side of the Atlantic, to this part of the world, here you have this writer in Mexico. Remember that Cortés and his army conquer the Aztecs. They arrive in 1519, and by 1521, the Aztec kingdom is defeated. So by 1598, here you have this mestizo who is writing in Spanish. He's probably already Catholic, right? The Spaniards bring over the Western tradition, Catholic religion, all the customs, But he's introducing some Aztec words there. We don't know why. Okay, but this is a bilingual text, and so too in Quechua and Spanish over in Peru. But it's a very famous historian, Felipe Guaman Poma de Ayala, very famous historian. So he's combining. So what we were doing is nothing new. Then I redid the article in English, and I did some more research. I found this on the top left. This poem, Ausonius, he lived in Bordeaux, France. Now, there was no Greek community in France, okay? This is a different type of bilingualism because this is bookish bilingualism. It's not lived. It's not existential. You don't go in and out of two cultures like we do here in Tempe, in and out of Hispanic context into the mainstream and back and forth. That we know of, there was no Greek community in Bordeaux, France, okay? He was just educated. He knew classical Greek and classical Latin. So there he is, working. The poets are free to experiment. So my hang-up with Alurista, why is he mixing? Well, that belongs to another period. Yes, we can. Now I'm not interested in doing this. This was something that I did. I don't do this anymore. It's in the past. I'm through with that. And then Eliot and Pound, they borrowed from everybody. Okay, so here's Pound using non combate italiano, Italian, and some Chinese. And look how the wasteland ends. La tierra baldía, that's a translation of the wasteland. It ends in Italian, puts in French, a little bit of Sanskrit, and English. They borrowed from everybody. So it's a different animal. I forgot to do that. That's very important. All right, so I was C for the movie Giant. I come now to this chapbook. Chapbooks are usually 10 points. No? It's a very brief book. We have a name in English. It's called chapbook. In Spanish, we use the French term, plaquette, una plaqueta. So, esta es una plaqueta. It's a plaquette chapbook. Oh, yeah, there it is. This is the cheapy type. This is very expensive. Now, usually they're in paperbacks, with the staples. And sometimes if you really want to get fancy and the editor, there's enough funds, they put a cover on top of this to cover the staples, okay? But that's fine, I'll take it. But he was kind enough to do 200 copies in hardback. You don't see a chapbook as a hardback. But I always like to show it off because it looks rather nice. I like it. This is the theme of the book is memory. All of us have memory here. The writer takes it one more step. As I said, I think before, am I repeating myself from yesterday? Writing. Memory and writing. So the theme of the book is memory and writing. So you have 2 poems on the next sheet. I'm only going to read one. You can take the other and read it at home. And the one I like to read, because I want to make sure I read some Penelope poem. Más la voz que el tiempo. Voice over time. And you have the translation, so you want to follow, you can, or follow the original. Más la voz que el tiempo. Quería escribir y me dolía. Toda la tarde atado al escritorio, a un papel sobre la mesa de trabajo, equivocándome, defendiéndome del error y del ocaso. Quiero decir que pasaron horas, luego días, y cómo entender la existencia que refugió en el aire y en penumbra. ¿Cómo decirlo exactamente? ¿Cómo trazarlo con bolígrafo o a lápiz? Lento es rememorar en claro, recorrer las sombras del recuerdo. Ahí también está la vida. Memoria mía, dame lo que es mío y enséñame la pura manera de contar lo que se ha ido, que pueda más la voz que el tiempo. All right, I'm going to indulge myself and read the translation. This is a beautiful translation. Sounds like the original, like an original poem. Voice over time. I wanted to write so badly, it hurt. All afternoon, tied to a desk, to a page flat out on a table. I was getting nowhere, just fending off failure in the darkening light. I want to say hours passed, then days, and how to grasp the essence that came shimmering in air and the obscuring shade. How exactly to say it, to get it laid out on paper with my pencil or pen. Slow, so slow, this process of clear recollection, of sifting back through the shadows of memory. There too is life. Oh, memory, my memory, give me back what is mine and guide me in the very telling of everything that stayed behind. May my voice win out over time. Borges used to say that sometimes the original is not faithful to the translation. You're supposed to laugh. You get my meaning? You get his meaning? The translation is so great that the original is just usually it's all the way around. The translation is not faithful to the original. He says that there are some great translations where the original is not faithful to the translation. Okay. Penelope, I got to read something up. A writer is always excited about his last book. This is 32 poems. I spent many, many years writing this book. Those of you, in 1 minute, I'll summarize the Odyssey. How about that? Can I do that in 1? There's a Trojan War that takes 10 years. It ends in the year of 1186. I hope I get that right. 1189, 1186, I flip them around. Before the Common Era, okay? The Greeks fight against the Trojans. So Odysseus is a Greek. So he has to leave behind his wife, Penelope. He goes off to fight 10 years in the Trojan War. He takes 10 more years to finally get back to Ithaca and to his now 20-year-old son, because he leaves Telemachus when he's a baby. Okay? Homer, taking all the information from the Odyssey, Homer doesn't tell us all that I want to know about Penelope. To me, she's a very exciting, very compelling character of literature, of Western literature. And I want to know more. What does she, when she prays to the gods and goddesses, what does she do? What does she think during the day? How does she interact with her son, with the maids, with the suitors? You know, after, I would say about the 13th year, 14th year, when news finally hits Ithaca and they know that the heroes have come back, Nestor and Agamemnon, they've all returned to their island. Well, where's Odysseus? So suitors come to the palace, 108 of them. Every day they come with gifts. They're trying to impress her so that they would marry one of them, okay? So how does she handle this? I mean, so I wanted to, when she weaves, she's a weaver, so I treat her as an artist, okay? So I wanted to know about the artist part of Penelope. Let me see if I can do here's how it begins. So spoke Penelope. And it's all in her voice. You don't have these. You don't have these. This is the palace where I've learned to survive, where 2 years ago I embraced Odysseus, stout son of Laertes, one last time. One long embrace was all it took to shape one heartbeat between us before he left for Troy. This is the palace I walk around in, from hall to hall, a world of stone and wood that is mine. This is the room where I work in wool and talk it out with myself, where still awake I toss and turn, pace around in the middle of the night, convincing myself once more that the earthly idea of love is still the lifeblood of my body. This is the palace where I wear the crown of faithfulness, where the sound of the sea is the sound I think with. Therefore, if I stand by a window, expecting each time to see the outline of a ship coming toward me, what is it but my love and the passion time gives it to grow for Odysseus, like-minded husband of the cunning mind for whom I wait? So spoke Penelope when she awoke this morning, when the golden cloth of dawn rose out of the sea. The waiting. Has ever a woman waited like me? Waited, and if she hadn't, would have had too much to lose, would have been denied so terribly a husband, not to mention orchards, many, droves of sheep and swine, plow fields all around, and twining vines for wine. How many women, I wonder, have waited like me by the sea, with a racing, caring heart, women who waited, stood waiting, lay waiting like me. From where you are every night above me, tell me with your truthful mouth, sky god Zeus, tell it clearly to me, Athena and Apollo, luminous gods and goddesses who inhabit the high halls of Olympus. How many women before me have waited like me? Now, we know she loves Odysseus, but right at the middle of the book, I put this poem where, she has to not always love him. She has her doubts. Is this guy ever coming back or what? Possessed by doubt. Do not be cross with me, Odysseus, source of my worry and my woe. If by and by I loathe you for the anxious nights you give me, nights that wreck me to the core. What's more, and must be said in this battlefield of love, time and time again I love you, then I go the other way and love you not. Day in, day out, each day that travails me, when I feel denied, when my unsleeping thoughts go round and round my head, I cry out your name as if it were honey on my tongue, the sound resounding in this room, giving hope to this island realm and me alone. Whereupon I smile to swallows high in the warm air, going past with a will to fly. Soon after, in the spread of stars, I find reason to love you, and then another, and another. Still in all, Odysseus, grief giver of a husband, destroyer of hearts, let me not die aching in one place. I loathe you for your absence, for the sorrow that lowers me to bed weeping, for keeping Telemachus our son and me your wife waiting, for sending no message down the years, no final word to soothe this range of anger, this heart beginning now to be possessed by doubt. Let's end it right there. I'll read the last poem that you have from the sheet. The next poem I was going to read is Back to Love. She recovers from her doubts. I want to read from the book that I did not read, Convocación de Palabras, which you have, Crónica de mis años peores. This is a homage to words. You see some words in there in English, intercalated, inserted into the poem. These are words that I have in these little notebooks that I used to keep when I was working at the furniture factory. I wound up working at a furniture factory. Graduated from high school in 1960. I went to visit my aunt in Chicago, two aunts, Tia Hortensia and Tia Carlota. When I came back in August, a furniture factory, we had no industry in San Marcos, okay? A furniture factory had moved from San Antonio, so the city must have given a nice tax break or something, but there it was, and so I wound up working there for 3.5 years before I was drafted into the Army. I did not want to work at the furniture factory. I wanted to work at the post office. Someone said, well, there's a civil service exam you have to pass, and there's math in it. Not my favorite subject in high school. Another person said there's analogies in the civil service. I said, what are analogies? Well, I have to find out. Another person said that there's a vocabulary section in the exam. And I said, if I learn all the words in the dictionary, I have a crack at it. I'll score so high that it will pull me up and I'll pass the exam. And my friends, what I'm telling you could have happened last weekend, because this was a life-changing experience. I remember it clearly. Every word from then on, from that moment on, that I did not understand in English, that I did not know the definition of, I would write it down on these little notebooks. And I would look up the meaning, and with a pencil, not with ink, with pencil, I would write out the definition and just commit them to memory. I shouldn't admit this in front of you, but I probably had a better vocabulary when I was working at the furniture factory than I do now. I mean, it just got out of hand. I mean, se me fue la mano, and it was ridiculous. I had the most ridiculous vocabulary. I could tell you stories about that. Anyway, I only wanted to pass the civil service exam, and little did I know that one day I would wind up at a university, and that these words that I would write this third book appointment, and that some of these words, I plucked them out of them. Okay, in this country, if you're a good player of any sport, and you come from a miserable, lower socioeconomic conditions, from one day to the next, you can be a millionaire, a multimillionaire. You can sign these lucrative contracts. I thought I was a pretty good baseball player. I'm a lefty. I had a pretty good curveball. But no scouts came knocking at my door. So. And el profesor would not have invited me had I become a baseball player and had I become a postal clerk. So I'm here because I've done something with words. And what saved me was words. Okay? Education. Convocación de palabras. I hope I'll tell you later. Convocación de palabras. Yo no era mío todavía. Era 1960 y lo recuerdo bien porque equivocaba a diario el sentido de los párrafos. En la umbría de una tarde enmugrecida, con aire desvalido, asistí a la vergüenza de no entender del todo lo que el televisor estaba resonando en blanquinegro. Desharás, me dije, las sanciones en tu contra, irresoluto adolescente, recién graduado y tardío para todo, disciplinado a no aprender nada, harás por ti lo que no pudo el salón de clase. Esta será tu fe. Infraction, bedlam, ambiguous. Las convoqué en el altar de mi deseo, llevándolas por necesidad a la memoria. En la fecundidad de un instante me fui multiplicando, affable, prerogative, egregious. Cada vez tras otra asimilé su historia, lo que equivale a rescatar lo que era mío. Priggish, issue, impecunious. Porque las hice doctrina repetida horariamente, de súbito yo ya no era el mismo de antes. Assiduous, faux pas, suffragette. Ahora desciendo inagotablemente de ellas. Son mi hereditaria ofrenda, huellas de sangre vivida sobre el papel constante. Exhume, queremonious, kibitzer. Tenaz oficio el de crearme en mi propia imagen, cada vez con cada una al pronunciarla, postprandial, subsequently, y de escribir por fin con voluntad las 14 letras de mi nombre y por encima la palabra libertad. Comments or questions? I'll take them. Sí, dime. Sí, dime.
En español. Digo, el poema tuyo en función de palabras, ¿no? Que está
Function of words.
central al
Yeah.
librito de
Yeah.
crónica de...
Yeah, it's in there. Yeah, unction of words. Yeah.
Okay, I think that's the one that sort of like centers you, links you to your vocation as a poet, and then your language and verses and your links to traditions.
Yeah, he's mentioning this because he picked it up for an anthology that he did. So yeah,
I also think that poem signals a turnover of generations, in which those who founded Chicano poetry at that period, they became aware of their mortality, and now they're looking ahead for who's gonna take the voice.
pick up the voice.
But I'm just trying to see whether that poem is also central to all your work, particularly since what you have shown us here today is not just the Chicano tradition or the Chicano universe, it's just the whole world.
Yeah, that's the end poem, isn't it? The book, Función de Palabras, yeah, I forget. It was, let's see where it goes in the book.
And also there, I think you quote,
No, that was the one that I didn't read. No, Dejar de recordar otra vez. No, Unción de Palabras, the words are, the painters paint with paint, and the writers write with words. You have to shape, you give a painter a canvas and some paints here, and they're supposed to make some kind of geometric designs on the canvas, and a sculptor, you give him a block of something with some chisels and a hammer, and if you come back and it's still a block, then you've done nothing with the material. We have dictionaries. There are words in there, so we manipulate the words. I mean, that's one of the there's a theme of liberation. This poem that I just read, La Libertad. I thought that baseball was going to save me. No, what happened was that word saved me. So there's the theme of self-salvation, self-redemption, self-salvation. There's an existentialist theme, no? El hombre que se hace a sí mismo, no? The man who creates himself, and the importance of words and memory, words and memory. Yeah, these are all little threads. Hilos conductores, no? Hilos conductores. These traveling threads that go through the book. I call them that anyway. Está bien, se entendió, ¿no? Hilos conductores.
Así es, sí.
Usted al inicio habló de poetas de lengua inglesa, ¿no? Que le fascinan, nos escuchamos sus poemas, pero no mencionó poetas de lengua española que le fascinan.
Well, if I were, she's asking you mentioned poets that write in English, but you didn't mention your influences, poets who write in Spanish. Well, if I were, since I consider myself fully bilingual, if I were reading at the Spanish house, La Casa Española, that would be a completely different reading. A different context. How the poets that have influenced me, what I like about them, the Baroque poets, the Barrocos. Yeah, my dissertation was on 3 Spanish poets from Spain. I met them all. One was my professor. And they all were very kind to me, and I went into their homes and I taped them. I interviewed them, and those became an appendix at the end of my dissertation. 100 pages per poet, and then the appendix of the interviews. Yeah, so they were very important. In fact, who do I quote? An epigraphe here. José Manuel Caballero Bonal, no? Crónica de mis años peores, dije lo que soy. I take the title from one of his. Some people know Caballero Bonal he's from Andalusia, from Jerez de la Frontera, where sherry comes from. He's a very Baroque kind of poet. Some people know him as a novelist. I don't read. That's one of my lagunas. I don't read novels. I should, but it's one of my lagunas. He's given me his novels, but I love his poetry, and he influenced me. And so there's a lot of Caballero Bonal here, a lot of resonance. And other poets, Octavio Paz. And if you're in Spanish, you got to read Lorca and all the icons, all the ¿cómo se llama? The canonized, todos los yeah, que pertenecen al canon, ¿no? Machado, I've learned from, writers read. Before there's writing, there's reading.
¿Puedo hacer otra pregunta?
Sí, cómo no.
Yo vengo de otra universidad donde hice una tesis de máster sobre poesía, pero aquí en Estados Unidos cambié de género, bueno, se puede hablar de género, mixed géneros, etcétera, etcétera. ¿Usted cree que todavía hay, a mí me fascina la poesía, ¿usted cree que hay lectores para poesía todavía? ¿Que vale la pena escribir? Sí, que hay lectores para poesía.
Sí, yo creo que sí, se sigue publicando, por lo menos en los grandes centros de lo que yo conozco de Estados Unidos, from what I know, what she's asking about is there a market, is there an audience for poetry? And my response is yes. I mean, especially in the big Chicago and the East Coast, on the West Coast, I say that poetry sells. Yeah, and around Boston, oh my God! Since we have, here's a statistic for you. Around Boston, around the 50-mile radius of Boston, there are 50 colleges and universities. So invariably, there's some writer that's been invited by the English department or the Spanish department or the French department, who is reading somewhere. You can't go. I can't take it all in. It's too much. So yes, there are bookstores and yeah. The gentleman who, the poet, he's a poet. He's a philosopher. We have a store in Cambridge called the Grolier. You can Google it. Grolier, the Grolier Bookshop, poetry bookshop. It's celebrating its 85th birthday now. It's one of 3 poetry bookstores in the nation. One is in Seattle, another one in Boulder, I think, and then this one in Cambridge. It was going to shut down about 7 years ago. The lady who was running it, who had bought it, became ill, and she was just dealing with too many problems, so she was going to close it. Well, when Mr. Menkiti, who was from Nigeria, teaches philosophy at Wellesley College, when he heard about it, he bought the store. He himself is also a poet. And so the store sells books, but then all of a sudden he wanted to also publish books. So he publishes one or 2 books per year. So he wanted to see. He asked me, can I look at the Penelope? And then I could go on and on about why he picked it. But anyway, yes. So he's publishing now poetry. Yeah, and there's an audience, at least in Cambridge, Boston, and around all these universities. That's quite a statistic when I heard that. I had a friend visit from San Marcos to Boston, Cambridge, so we had dinner in Boston. I was going to take him to Cambridge. So we're waiting for a cab, and so I tell my friend, around Boston, 50-mile radius, there are 50 colleges and universities. And so he thinks a minute, and he says, so if you live here in Boston and you don't go to a university, you're stupid. I said, yeah. My God, 50 colleges and universities. Some of them are 2-year schools too, not only 4-year. But yeah. Anyway, comments, questions. If not, I hope you.
¿Te considerarías
Sí.
el poeta chicano más occidentalizado?
Occidentalizado. I don't know what that is.
Digo, por las tradiciones, su último libro tiene que ver con un poema griego.
Oh, I see. Well, it's our tradition. That's what we've been. Yeah.
Sí.
Yeah. Rome.
Porque hay los que se consideran muy nahuas.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
Otros,
Yeah. Yeah. This is a trend in Chicano poetry where you have Chicano. I don't romanticize the Aztecs. That was very important during the Chicano movement of acknowledging your indigenous background. We have Spanish surnames. I know where it's coming from, and the only poem that comes close is the one that you mentioned, where since the title of the book is Crónica de mis años peores, I decided to write a poem about chronicling. So I'm asking the Aztec from the indigenous side. I did not come from the Aztecs. but it represents the indigenous part of the mestizo people, Mexican Chicanos, though, basically, in general, there are mestizo people. So I'm going to ask the Aztec Tlaquilo, who was the scribe, who went to school. They actually got educated. They went to school. They knew how to read. They knew math, and they knew how to paint and draw. They're the ones who draw the codices. No, correct me if I'm wrong. So I'm going to ask the Tlaquilo to help me with my humble crónica. No? So he's a chronicler. I'll also ask Cabeza de Vaca from the Spanish side. And what's interesting here is that Cabeza de Vaca, we've been hearing since I was 6 years old in Texas. I've been hearing about Cabeza de Vaca because he came to Texas and he lived with the Indians. He was shipwrecked. He starts out with how many men? With 400 men from Cuba. Yeah, and they all shipwreck. They all die eventually, or they get killed by the Indians. They die of hunger. They get shipwrecked. Winds come up, and they toss them. Anyway, finally, only 3 of those guys survive. In the end, he gets separated from the other 2 Españoles, and he lives with the Indians in Texas. Whatever they do, he does. They go to Galveston, what's Galveston today, to pick shells, whatever. He does that. If they run around naked, he runs around naked. He learns the language. He becomes bilingual and bicultural. You know anyone who's bilingual and bicultural? My God, what a connection there. So he's part of the roots of Chicano literature. But then that was an MLA panel that I held back in '89 to acknowledge que las crónicas españolas, the Spanish chroniclers, that is the texts that were written, what is it today, the Southwest, written by Españoles before 1848, they're part of Chicano lit. They're the roots of Chicano lit. In the same way that in the 13 colonies, anything written before July the 4th, 1776, not written by Americans, because America didn't exist, they were British subjects. Those are part of American literature. So if that goes, if you accept that premise, and there are anthologies that present us the American literature that way, then you have to accept that the Crónicas Españolas are part of Chicano lit. Yeah. So I asked Cabeza de Vaca to also help me in my little humilde. Sí,
Bueno, muchas gracias. Esta vez
Thank
sí
you.
ya-